All right, we're live. You can go ahead.
All right, welcome everyone. So my name is Jana Ludwig, and I am the outgoing chair of Southeast Wyoming's Democratic Socialists of America chapter and a member worker of the Solidarity House Cooperative, who are the two co-hosts of tonight's event. And on behalf of both organizations, I just want to welcome everybody. We are two of the groups who are dedicated to helping open up what's possible in Wyoming politics and mutual aid organizing and building working class power. So if you come away from tonight excited about the content, I want to encourage you to consider supporting some truly independent media in Wyoming. So Solidarity House is 100% grassroots supported, and we would really appreciate it if you could support us on Patreon, even if just with $5 a month. And if you can't do that, we get it. We center the struggles of working class and poor people in everything that we do. And so almost all of our content is actually free on Podbean and iTunes and Spotify. And we have 113 episodes under our belts, and a bunch of them are about Wyoming. So there's a lot to listen to at this point. And again, we're Solidarity House on all of those platforms, as well as Twitter and Facebook. And if you believe in things like a $15 an hour or even more minimum wage, worker ownership, and the rights to organize and strike, I'd like to personally invite you to consider joining and organizing with DSA. The week before, Representative Carly Provenza introduced the $15 per hour minimum wage in the Wyoming legislature. Our DSA chapter consents to making labor organizing, and specifically the Fight for 15, our first focused campaign. So we were delighted to see Wyoming Democrats in both houses getting behind this bill. And although it's already been killed, we are taking this time tonight to start building support for the next legislative session. And we would love to have you as a comrade in that work. Okay, so that's the end of the pitches. And speaking of comrades, I am now delighted to turn this over to our moderator for tonight, Matt Stannard.
Thanks, Jana, and it's great to see everybody. As Jana mentioned, our chapter chose the path and the project of labor mobilization as, and that's our DSA chapter chose the path of labor mobilization, which includes tackling a bunch of things in the long run: right to work legislation, empowering and organizing our teachers and our public sector workers, and of course the fight for $15 an hour, which is a national fight, as well as now, thanks to Representative Provenza and her colleagues in the House and Senate, is also a Wyoming fight. DSA nationally, as Jana mentioned, is growing. It's at nearly 100,000 members nationwide. Our chapter, Southeast Wyoming Democratic Socialists of America, is growing with upwards of 50 members nationwide, and several dozen of those folks very much active and committing to fight for these issues over the next year. And that, I think, is a good data point for our elected officials to know that there is mobilization around labor issues and around working class issues in Wyoming, and that you can find the bodies that you need to find to do that campaigning, to make those calls, to do that agitation and education. If you keep making the bills, then we can keep mobilizing folks around those issues, while also emphasizing direct action strategies and mutual aid strategies.
Hey, Matt, I'm going to hop in for a second. Can you make me a co-host? Representative Clifford is waiting to get in, and I can watch the waiting room.
Certainly. Thank you very much. And I will also quickly admit those three folks, and you can keep an eye on that. Thank you so much, Jana.
Yep, you bet.
And what a thrill it is to have so many of our electeds here, as well as these on-the-ground activists. So we're really happy to see those folks. I want to introduce our other speakers briefly first. We have, first of all, As we said, we have Barry McCann and Amanda Barnes here from Southeast Wyoming DSA, but Barry's a veteran organizer. Amanda is a powerful voice and has been a powerful voice for working class empowerment in Wyoming. And then, of course, we have Jason Call, who's a former U.S. House candidate in Washington, as well as a Fight for 15 organizer and an all-around organizer for working class issues. So what we're going to do is, and as I said, we're really happy to see the sponsors of HB 206 here. Please, in fact, please give Representatives Provenza and Clifford a hand for sponsoring that bill, even though you can't hear us clap. I want to say thank you for fighting for working people in Wyoming. We know it's a struggle. We know that it is a new narrative to have a genuinely militant and empowered working class fighting in Wyoming, and we appreciate so much that you're a part of that. And we want you to know that we're here for that. We're here for the struggle. We welcome the struggle, and thank you for rolling those stones uphill. Some preliminary business. We're going to hear from I want to hear from our representatives first, and we'll hear from Representative Provenza and Representative Clifford first, and then we're going to hear from our other speakers, and we'll introduce them one at a time. And this is really a forum about HB 206 and why it is /was/will be good for Wyoming, and how to organize and strategize for it coming out of that unceremonious dismissal and going into next year. We've posted resources that are educational resources about Fight for 15 nationally, and we're happy to have debates about the details of those arguments, but that's not really why we're here tonight. What we want to do tonight is share perspectives and advice, including on how to answer standard arguments and build solidarity and empathy with people who might not at first glance support it. But ultimately, this is a strategy session to figure out how we can increase our wages as working people in Wyoming. So that's why we're here. And if people want to have other conversations later on down the line, you should get a hold of us at DSA and get a hold of us at Solidarity Collective, and we'd be happy to have those conversations with you. But this really is a strategy session for that struggle, that workers' struggle to increase wages. So I want to start by introducing Carly Provenza, newly elected representative this year, and really a central voice in the introduction of HB 206. Thank you for coming, Representative Provenza.
Thank you for having me, Matt, and members of DSA. I ran because I come from a family that has struggled with economic insecurity, and I sure didn't want to leave people behind when I got over here to Cheyenne to do that work. It's really important that people have a living wage, that the people of Wyoming are valued in the work that they do. All work has dignity and worth, and all people in the state of Wyoming have that. It was easy to bring the bill, but the hard work is in front of us. You're absolutely right. We need to do organizing. I'm ready and willing to do that. House Bill 206. What we ended up doing was $15. Let's just start, and then let's get rid of tipped wages, and let's get rid of youth wages where folks get paid less for being younger. It's absolutely not true that just young high schoolers are working minimum wage jobs. And again, everybody's time is worth what they are, which is more than what Wyoming's minimum wage is $5.15.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming And yeah, thank you for including those provisions in the bill. And of course, you can hear the arguments that people often make about how tipped workers make a bunch of money. And I'm sure that when we hear from Jason in a few minutes, we'll hear a little bit about how to deal with some of that pushback and how to frame these arguments. But first, we're also equally honored to have Representative Andy Clifford here. And Representative Clifford has now served for many years, again, the interests of working people, the interests of folks who are forgotten in the dominant discourse in Wyoming. And thank you so much, Representative Clifford, for sponsoring the bill and for coming to talk to us tonight.
Dos kausini. Good evening. Hisseja na Asitna. My Rapo name is Coming Woman. Born and raised all my life on the Wind River Indian Reservation. And I come from a background where my people have participated in systems for far too long where they haven't been valued. And systems weren't designed for our participation or our protection. And so when Representative Carly approached me to sponsor this legislation, it was an easy ask. I mean, I have no qualms about doing this. And what I've learned in my start of my third year in the legislature, a second term, is it's important, and we hear it from our minority leader, Kathy Connolly, is to prime the pump on issues that are important to the hardworking people of Wyoming. And I just want to thank my colleague for having the courage to present this bill, submit it, have it introduced, and it's on the list. But I don't think of it as a loss. It wasn't introduced, but that's okay. And our colleagues know what we stand for and what's important to us here. And that's what's important. So I'm glad, I'm honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to learning. Thanks.
Thank you, and again, thank you for sponsoring the bill and for coming to this meeting. Because if you're in this space, if you're occupying this space, whether it's in the Zoom space or if you're one of the folks that are watching on YouTube or Facebook Live right now, it's because you already know that the bill, didn't get introduced, but you're here anyway because you want to know what you can do to gear up and prime the pump for next year and for subsequent sessions, as well as how this struggle is tied to a whole, I would say, a whole menu of workers' rights and wages and benefits and protections as Wyoming enters this transition economically and energy-wise that we're going to do. And I think it would be really easy to say that, to kind of cede the control of that narrative, of that transition, to the same economic interests who have put us here in the first place. And I think that the demand for 15 is one that says we won't accept that narrative, because whatever it is that we're going to do, we're going to decide what that is together, and we're going to make sure that people have enough to live in the interim. And so with that, I want to introduce Jason Call. Jason was a House candidate in Washington State, as well as an organizer for Fight for 15 and many other campaigns. And we're really excited to have Jason here to give some perspectives from a successful Fight for 15 campaign in Washington. So welcome, Jason.
Appreciate it very much, Matt and Yana, for the invitation. I am actually an active candidate for 22 for the same district, Washington 2nd
Thank
District. You. So yeah, I mean, we have had some successes here in Washington State, and I don't know how well this is known nationally, but it was actually SeaTac, which is where our major airport is, that was the first place in Washington that got the $15 minimum wage. And the way they got the minimum wage is there were a bunch of airport workers who were union workers at one point, and they had been laid off, and then they were hired back at very substandard wages as non-union workers. And a lot of these groups were immigrants. We have a lot of East African immigrants here, Somali, Ethiopian, Sudanese, and they were not treated well by the airlines, and they started community organizing within their own groups, and then that filtered out to church groups. The church groups in the area were very, very supportive. And just to touch on what your representative said here, two things that are super important. One is that all work has dignity, and that's really what the church groups brought to the table, was this idea that anybody who has a job should be able to live with dignity. And not, I don't want to go beyond that and say everybody should be able to live with dignity. So this is not just people who are working people. Some people can't work. Some people can only work part-time. Everybody deserves a living situation that is dignified. But certainly, if you are on the job and doing this backbreaking work of baggage handling that that the people at the airport are doing, they come away from that with a lot of physical problems, because they're straining their bodies constantly, day after day after day, doing this work. So they had gone from an $18 unionized wage down to $9.50 as non-union workers, and they decided that they were not going to accept it. So there was community organizing within the communities who were doing that work. There were church groups that had come to work. There was a lot of resistance from the airline industry, because they wanted to say, well, we're kind of international carriers. What you do as a city here in SeaTac shouldn't affect us. Thankfully, we had judges who were on the side of the people who were seeking the minimum wage, and they struck down the appeal from Alaska Airlines and Hertz, who were trying to fight this. But really what it came down to is SeaTac was a city of about 30,000. So not huge, not like Seattle. And so it was a small city that community organized and put this, and going to what Representative Clifford said, put this on the table. It has to go on the table at some point. Everything is a starting point. And they fought it for a couple of years. I mean, the airlines and the community, it took years, probably 2 or 3 years, for them to actually get the city of SeaTac to pass this as a referendum. Once it was passed as a referendum, the momentum really carried national, and it carried up to Seattle itself, Seattle proper, which is just a couple of miles north of SeaTac. And by 2014, the Seattle City Council had passed a 7-year plan for transition from the minimum wage. I don't remember what it was at that point, onto a $15 minimum wage. In fact, in 2021, we just hit the $15 mark, where workers in Seattle are now getting a $15 minimum wage. But I want to tell you something. A lot of this is driven by the increase in land values. As you know, property values have gone through the roof in Seattle here. Property values have tripled in the last 20 years. They have doubled in the last 6 years. And what we find is a lot of these minimum wage workers can't afford to live in the cities that they work in. And we have to, again, community organizing, having leaders like your representatives here, but also community leaders like Yana, and people like, as you know, Shama Sawant, who is instrumental in putting this front and center in Seattle City Council year after year after year. But one of the things that also happened then is that once it had passed in SeaTac, once it had passed in Seattle, even though it was graduated, we moved on to, in 2016, passing a statewide minimum wage increase that went from, I think we were down somewhere below $10 to $13.50. So not $15, but again, a 4-year. What we're talking about is a growth of understanding among your general population that these things are possible, that they're necessary, and that they are what provides people dignity. So we ended up getting a statewide minimum wage of $13.50, and we are going to increase that. Hopefully we can do it federally. Obviously it was taken off the table here, but I want to go back to CTAC that started this journey in 2011, got it passed in 2013. CTAC now has, I believe, the highest minimum wage in the country. They are at $16.69. So my message to everybody in Wyoming is organize, get your unions together, get your ethnic groups together, because they are often very solidified and very organized amongst themselves. Get your church groups together and continue the fight. So, we were able to do it here in Washington. We have a lot of big business fighting against us. And if we can do it here, it's possible everywhere. So that's the message I wanted to bring to you. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Jason. I'm looking forward to us having a Q&A and a little bit more of an informal chat session after the last two speakers, so that we really can hone some strategies, or at least some strategic goals, out of this discussion. So thank you so much for your perspective. I never knew that CTAC was that small, and that does put things in perspective, given that we're dealing with smaller cities and smaller communities here, but nevertheless, communities of people that need living wages. I want to introduce Amanda Barnes next. And Amanda is a member of Southeast Wyoming DSA, as well as an unapologetic voice for particularly, working moms and working people in the Laramie area. And it's great to have you here, Amanda. Go ahead.
Thanks for having me and asking me to speak tonight. Good evening, everybody. My name is Amanda Barnes. I live and work in Laramie. And tonight I'm here to testify as to what raising the minimum wage would have done for Wyoming workers. To say that I'm disappointed that the bill for raising the Wyoming minimum wage to $15 an hour was killed right out of the gate is an understatement. It's discouraging to know that the majority of our state officials don't see paying a living wage as a high priority when they talk so much about how our economy is dwindling and putting the state at risk. It's a known fact that wage workers keep things going, because every dollar we spend, every dollar we make goes right back into the economy. And so this creates a higher demand for products and services, which in turn creates more jobs, which in turn again creates more revenue. I mean, it's just good economics. And from a business standpoint, it baffles me why this bill would be dead on arrival. From a low wage earner standpoint, I have recently experienced firsthand what a wage hike can do for a family who has been living in poverty for over a decade. In October of 2019, I was working one job through the university and took on a second working at a local elementary school for a couple hours a day. While both jobs paid more than the national minimum wage, it still wasn't enough. We still needed food stamps, and I was barely able to pay my bills. Working two jobs, one of which was in the evening, was really taxing on my home life. I barely got to see my children and had very little time for anything else, especially considering for a portion of that time after I started the second job, I had to walk 45 minutes into town to get to the elementary school, and then turn around and walk another half an hour to my second job and sit and wait in the lobby and wait for my shift to start. I was exhausted, I was depressed, and felt like I was in this never-ending cycle of just financial despair. It was inevitable that when the paychecks rolled in, bills were going to be due. I was going to be stuck trying to figure out whether or not to pay them or to fix my car. Thankfully, a friend of mine gifted me her vehicle because she is financially well off enough to do so, and she wanted to help. And the day she signed the car over to me, I actually stood in the treasurer's office of the courthouse and cried, because for the first time in years, it was one less thing I had to worry about. Around tax season of 2020, 2 positions came open at the elementary school, and the director of the school actually asked me to fill them both. So I went ahead and quit my job at the university, and I actually gained a pay raise of $15 an hour through the elementary school. With that raise and it being tax season, I figured out how to get my family off of the SNAP program for the first time in over 10 years. Despite what some people think, the poor, we are actually very good at budgeting and we don't like to be on public assistance. So I sat down and budgeted our way off of food stamps, praying that it would last more than a month or two. We also spent that summer making repairs to my home, which had a badly leaking roof, holes in the floor that we had boards like nailed down over, and pipes so old that we can't drink the water for fear of getting lead poisoning. If it weren't for the pay raise, we would actually not be living in our home right now. It was in that bad of condition. We were still living paycheck to paycheck, knowing full well that things could change at any moment, but we were finally starting to see some security in our lives for the first time in over a decade. Fast forward to a year later, tax season 2021. Thanks to making that living wage at a really great job that I love, I got a larger tax return than I would have if I was making $8, $9, $10, or even $11 an hour. I paid an entire year's worth of lot rent so that my paychecks from here until February of next year can be used for continuing the repairs on our house, any emergencies that might pop up. And I've been working on building a greenhouse so that I can further, be more self-reliant for my family. This is what a living wage looks like to a low income wage earner. It doesn't look like big screen TVs, $1,000 smartphones, brand new cars paid in cash, lavish vacations, or steak and lobster every night, like some people would have everyone else believe. And even if that's what we wanted to spend our money on, it's nobody's business. But in reality, it's not about keeping up with the Joneses. It's about not having to worry over where our next meal comes from, what bills are going to get paid, or if our only home is going to be condemned because we can't keep up with repairs. It's about using that money to keep our heads above water instead of wondering when the day comes that we are going to sink entirely. The fight for 15 or more, because in reality, it should be more. It's not over. It will continue day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year until it happens. 1 second. Sorry, my alarm's going off to remind me to drink water. I mean, the high school kid that is working to save up for college, the college kid working their way through school, the newlyweds trying to start a family, the single parents just trying to feed their kids, the retiree who can't live on Social Security checks alone, and every other low wage worker in between. We are the backbone of Wyoming, and we deserve so much more than we are getting. And thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much for your very powerful words. This is not a hypothetical, as someone just said in the chat. It's life and death for many families. It is the ability to thrive. It's the ability to not have to make those terrible choices. And so that's what's at stake here. Thanks so much for giving it life. Our last speaker, before we get to more of a discussion mode, is Barry McCann. Barry?
Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm kind of new to living in Cheyenne. I've only been living here 2 years, but I've been working here 17 years. And when I heard Representative Provenza talk about the $15 minimum wage in young people. That really hit home for me since I'm a teacher in town. And when we first started talking about this, or when I first started hearing about us doing a 15-hour minimum wage law in our state, I started talking to my students in class about this, kind of asking them what did they think that would mean for them. A lot of the students I work with come from a little background of economic insecurity. So I was kind of curious to see how they would greet a $15 an hour minimum wage. And uniformly, every one of the students was behind it, because a lot of the students that I work with aren't going to go on to college afterwards. So they were thinking that $15 an hour is something that they could actually live on. And they were very excited about that, because they, most of them are making in the $7, $8 an hour range. And some of them are helping take care of their family, paying some bills for the family, and that doesn't go very far. So when I was saying, what would you guys think about getting $15 an hour? They were almost speechless to think that that would even be a possibility. And that's one of the things that really hit me, is they just kind of assume that wages were just given by their employer and there's nothing they could do about that. And I think that was one of the things that really hit me when we start talking about this campaign, especially when I was working with these young people, is they don't necessarily know how social change or a change in laws come about. And then when we were talked more about, well, no, we can talk to your Congress people, your local representatives, and then we can build a movement that says we need to raise our wage. A lot of them really had never encountered that. And the idea that they thought that you could kind of fight for something and you didn't just have to rely on the grace of your employer, I think really excited a lot of them. So when they were given that idea, it's like, oh my gosh, we could push for this. I was thrilled to see the excitement that they had, that this wasn't just something they had to accept. And so that's what I started talking to them about, is like, would you become involved in this type of movement? How could you contribute? How would it change your lives? And I was thrilled at the excitement that they had, because a lot of them, like I said, come from financially insecure backgrounds, and the idea that they can maybe speak, or they could live with dignity, like someone said at the beginning of this, that was like a completely new thing to them. And to see them excited about it gave me hope about being able to organize this type of movement in Wyoming and in Laramie and Cheyenne and all the other places. So this has given me hope, because the young people got very excited about the idea that they could push for something that would make their lives better. And like I said, one of the big takeaways I got from talking to them is that it really gave them a different view about how things happen in our country. That if you have something you want to do, you can get involved and actually make that change. And now I guess for us as a group who's working on this, that's the point we got to get to, is getting people involved who will be impacted by this, and it will make it a positive impact on their lives. How do we get them going? And that's, I think, where I'm at with my students. What are you going to do? What would you like help with? Can you join this movement with us? I'm excited for it.
Thank you very much, Barry. We're excited listening to that, especially that that maybe big eye-opening moment where people say, wow, you can fight for better wages. Wages are not just something that falls down from the beneficence of our employers and bosses. It's actually something we can struggle for. And I think that you can carry that analogy to so many things. If that is a consciousness that's emerging among young people in Wyoming, and for the young people who choose especially to stay in Wyoming, then that's very good news indeed. There I want to go ahead and move to some questions, and one of the first questions is for Representatives Provenza and Clifford, and that is because I know this this bill had a short life in terms of when it was floating out. Was there any pushback? Were there any arguments? Did anyone say anything to you about, well, this is why this is wrong, or this is why this is a bad idea? Did that even come up preceding or during this year's session?
Yeah, I didn't have conversations really with my colleagues before they killed it. It was just that I think that the pushback that I've had has just been, well, that's just going to harm small businesses. You're going to put so many people out of, you're going to eliminate jobs, right? Because now these businesses are going to close. Well, it's okay if there are a reduction in jobs if we raise minimum wage, because now we're just paying people to, live with 40 hours a week instead of having to work multiple jobs and make, less money and have to put in 70 hours a week to get by. I'm okay with some people losing some jobs, because having to work multiple jobs is too hard. And and hearing that, like, oh, well, you're basically tripling the minimum wage, and how could you just go from 5 to 15, and don't you think there's room for compromise? And my response to some folks was just like, what's the compromise? Because people are dying because they don't have health care in this state. People are making decisions that are life and death with food. What bills am I going to pay? How am I going to get through the week? And so getting someone from where they are to where they can thrive is the goal. The goal is not to just give them a little bit more when they need far more than a little bit. So that I think that's the pushback in Wyoming is, I mean, very, very few people also get paid minimum wage, which is another pushback, or our state's minimum wage, because our minimum wage is below the federal minimum wage. So there was definitely that pushback of, well, no one actually gets paid $5.25 or whatever an hour. And that doesn't, to me, my pushback is that doesn't matter, because the people that are making $10 an hour aren't making it. We have to lift up everybody, not just a few people who are making the minimum wage. So yeah, there was definitely some of those conversations, but it wasn't, because we didn't get to have the conversation about when the bill would get introduced. It wasn't something I got to go into a committee and argue for and bring my people and the people of our community to come say, here's how this impacts me.
Would you say the same, Representative Clifford, in terms of maybe just very basic arguments, no arguments at all, maybe just ignoring the bill until it went away?
A little bit of everything. And so what I had heard, of course, no reason for why it was not going to be heard at all or introduced. But I did hear, in talking, the overall excuse, I guess, would be because we're in a pandemic and how we scheduled our session, that there was going to be lots of bills and we were just going to run out of time. So basically, not at the table, like Carly said, nobody asked. And, that's, I guess, that's just what happened. And, it's just, nobody talks about it. I mean, nobody, any of our colleagues really were worried about it or whatever, because I think they're just not at a place because they use the pandemic too, because they use that a lot of businesses are hurting, not so much, just as much as the small businesses, but large businesses as well too, and how we structured our CARES Act dollars, which I didn't feel was equitable across the board and how we spent those funds too. But a lot of people were hurting. A lot of people are hurting. They're still hurting. They've been hurting even before the pandemic. And at the end of the day, everybody here in Wyoming wants the same things at the end of the day, to have happy, healthy lives and live in Wyoming, our great state. And we're trying to do that. We're trying to fight that. And I think we Democrats in the legislature, we're few, but we're mighty. We do our homework. We work hard. Just today, the past couple of days, to witness my colleague in committee and present her bills. She does her homework. We do our homework. When you compare our colleagues from across the aisle, they don't do their homework. They get by with a bunch of I don't knows, or this is what the LSO drafted for me, and they're really disconnected to what's really going on in Wyoming in ways of where people are hurting.
That certainly seems true. There's a good conversation right now going on in the chat about the various exemptions in the various places where people are paid below even federal minimum wage, and that certainly does include tipped workers. There are also provisions where disabled workers who are part of particular exemptions can get paid less than minimum wage. There are exemptions for young people, and it seems like any struggle for higher wages needs to be universal, because if you don't make struggles universal, then it's so easy for some people to say, well, I've got mine and other people don't need theirs. And so something like lifting everyone up together, I think, is really important. Jason, how would you tell organizers and activists to engage about arguments and when people want to have debates about things? It seems like sometimes you want to engage those debates, and other times there's a time to do it and a time not to. What were some of the pushbacks that the Fight for 15 campaign in SeaTac and elsewhere ran into?
Well, a lot of pushback came from businesses, and I know we've talked a little bit about small businesses in the chat, but in particular, the restaurant and hospitality industries, where a lot of those workers are very, very low paid. There was a lot of pushback from those industries. And what we have found since the implementation of the $15 minimum wage is that those industries have actually grown substantially. There has been virtually zero impact. I mean, there may be one or two businesses that weren't, I guess, particularly well run or couldn't manage it, but the industry itself has grown with the minimum wage increase. And a lot of that comes down to community support. That our area is extremely supportive of people living in dignity. Now, we can't seem to get Amazon taxed by our city council, but beyond that, we have some crazy things going on with property values in our area. I mean, we have a lot of speculation with real estate, and it is driving the price of land up, and we're getting gentrification. We're having people pushed out of the area, so that is part of what's compounding our problem, with wages in general. But the reality is, as I think Representative Provenza said, most people aren't getting paid minimum wage. I mean, the average wage in Seattle is around $31 an hour right now anyway. So we're talking about taking a small subset of workers and making sure that they are compensated fairly and with dignity. So it has not impacted the industry. All of the wailing and gnashing of teeth that went on about how it's going to kill industry. So it has turned out to be completely not true. And then there are some real success stories from businesses who have said, look, we had to change our business model. And without getting into the details of how they did that, they said we had to adjust. But when we made those adjustments, our businesses actually grew. And it is beneficial to us to have workers coming to work healthy, happy, wanting to do better for the business because they know it does better for themselves. it's one of these ideas, this horrible socialist idea that everybody does better when everybody does better. And we've actually seen it in play here. It hasn't been perfect. There have been struggles, but in the long run, it has been beneficial to the trades who initially fought back against it. And so I would just encourage people to research those arguments and research the actual numbers. And when people come back and say to you, it is going to kill business in our city, it is going to kill business in our state, you can present to them the data that says you are absolutely wrong.
Thanks. Thank you, Jason. The next question comes from Matthew. And Matthew, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to ask the question.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. So I've seen various sources that estimate, like, at a national level, a living wage would be something somewhere around like $21 to $24 an hour if it was like consistently applied across the country. Do we have any idea what a living wage might be for Wyoming? Because I know Wyoming, technically, in various parts of Wyoming, we have like a lower cost of living than other parts of the country. But is 15 even enough for this fight? It's nice that it alliterates, but what do people know about the living wage in Wyoming?
I can answer that. So we have a organization in Wyoming that has done this self-sufficiency calculator. The Wyoming Women's Foundation, I believe, has done that. And what they've done is every county, they have been able to determine what someone needs to make if they live alone. So if they're a single adult, if they are a parent, and if their child is in preschool or newborn, or the other costs attributed with children, and then, or if you had two parents living in a home. In Albany County, for example, when you type in my self-sufficiency calculator, you'll find that for a single adult, that like you could be self-sufficient, which means that you can afford your bills, and like you can, if you have an emergency, you have enough to be able to pay for it. You wouldn't need to rely on anybody else. But it ranges anywhere from, I think, like $10. I mean, so in some places it's less than 15, right? And then when you have two adults, it's even less than that. But what ends up happening is the people who have, say, single parents, they need to make something like $17 an hour. There's a wide variety of like what people need to be self-sufficient. So Wyoming, I've heard some folks say, well, $12 an hour, and 15 would cover, a good chunk of people, but it certainly wouldn't cover everybody. You're absolutely right. Some people need to make more. And that's where we should meet people, the people who need to make more, right? But with this legislation, we started at that 15, and then we also cut out the tipped workers, and we cut out the other issues of being able to pay less than minimum wage.
If I can I just do a follow-up to that question?
Certainly.
Have you considered drafting some sort of legislation that communicates a living wage in terms of like the necessities of life rather than like a dollar value? Because part of the problem with all these minimum wage laws is we pass them, and then like 20 years pass and inflation occurs, and people are like driven into poverty because nobody passes. We have to keep passing them in order to keep up, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the considerations that I had that I didn't include in this legislation because the Legislative Service Office was just crammed with bills. But one thing I'd like to see is putting in an adjustment for inflation every year at the bare minimum. And maybe it's that we just add more to just account for a variety of different things. But you're right, you don't want to have to come back, particularly since we haven't raised our minimum wage in a very long time. And so starting there and then moving up is a good approach. And I think, future drafts, we should include an incremental increase with inflation, at least.
I wanted to quickly answer a question that had come up in chat of another argument that people make. It's more of a personal argument, and it's almost an argument that is designed to personalize what should be a collective political struggle. That argument is, why don't you just get a better job? And I know that we can all kind of go, oh, that's a silly argument. But for some reason, every time I hear people have a public debate about minimum wage, that comes up. Why don't we just get better jobs, Jason?
Well, a lot of people can't afford the education required to get those better jobs. I mean, we have people stuck in, in poverty where they don't have access to the loan. I mean, as a candidate for federal office, I'm for free college tuition. It doesn't make sense that we are not investing in our people so that they can better themselves and again better their communities when they better themselves. But it's really a ridiculous argument because there are a ton of jobs that simply aren't. I mean, there's different levels of jobs. And we need to, what kind of education do you need to be a baggage handler? But isn't the work of being a baggage handler important to the functioning of our society? And this really goes back to the base argument of all work deserves wage dignity, regardless of what it is that you're doing. And these aren't jobs that are going to be held by, so-called high school graduate necessarily. I mean, these are jobs that people get, and they are careers, and they expect benefits to go along with them, and you, as a workforce, you want a worker that is going to be committed to that job, because it's expensive to end up having to rehire people and retrain people and all of that stuff. So why not have somebody hired at a living wage who likes their job, who wants to do their job, regardless of what it is, and that we're going to pay them well for it. Because there are a million different kinds of jobs that are integral to the functioning of our society. They're all worth dignity.
As we found out during the pandemic, that the jobs that are considered to be the essential jobs are often some of the lowest paying jobs, certainly. So thank you for that, and thanks for the question.
Matt, can I interject here for a sec?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Amanda.
So years ago, when I was still living in Colorado, living in Montrose and traveling to Olathe every day to work in a nursing home, I absolutely loved my job. Granted, I did laundry, I cooked, I cleaned, but I loved my job. I loved being around the residents. I often brought my children in to see them because the residents absolutely loved seeing children. What made me quit my job was the fact that I had to be at work at 4 o'clock in the morning every day, doing piles and piles and piles of laundry, only making $8.50 an hour. People will stay at jobs if they're being paid better. I mean, it's simple as that, and the fact that our country has built this thing where low wage jobs are low income earners, I guess, are expendable. Yeah, okay, you quit because you're not making enough, we'll find another one in a minute, and it's disgusting that we have that mentality as a country.
There's some really good conversation going on in the chat, but we also only have a few minutes left, and I really want to turn to one thing that's the most important takeaway from this, and that is what we should be doing between now and the lead up to the next session. How can we create synergy between those of us who want to do this kind of campaigning and our elected leaders who are willing to take up the mantle to that? So let's ask those leaders, what can we do? What can we all do together heading into this year and the next session?
That's a great question. And I think the answer, I mean, is bringing people who are closest to the problem always. So finding the people in your communities and trying to build like county chapters, essentially getting people in your area that can get together and form a plan of action of what's going to work best to influence your representatives. And then getting them to put the pressure on that way, educating your communities. But I think having like little, like, you know, having a statewide organizing structure, but also just like, what are we doing in our local communities right around us so that our representatives or us, we see you doing that work and showing up and calling and advocating. I will plug an app right now just because I think it's super helpful. But if you search in your app store, I think it's Wyoming Legislative Roster or the Wyoming Rural Electric Company made the app. So I'll show you what it looks like if I can on the screen here. But this app, what it does is it looks like this. So you've got like this capital, this is the Wyoming capital, but yeah, the Wyoming Rural Electric Association. And I think you can even search WREA. But what this does is it gives you our phone numbers, our emails. You can text us and build a relationship with your lawmakers over the interim. Right now, we're really hard to get a hold of because we're just super busy. But build a relationship with people and talk with them about how much you are struggling. Bring people that are making minimum wage or less than 15. Bring people who are working in industries that are dying, that need a place to go work when we no longer have fossil fuels. And let them show up and advocate for themselves, because the people that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution.
Anything to add, Representative Clifford?
Gosh, we've been debating and she just took the words right out. So, I mean, it's so important. We all have embedded leaders. And when we talk, when I say embedded leaders, it's not your typical lawmakers or people that are in positions of power and authority. It's the single mothers and dads that are holding down the households, that are working hard, that have a lot of little lives depending on them. And so we need to start having those conversations with our embedded leaders, and the embedded leaders are who people respect, who people in the communities will go to for advice. And I have a lot of them on the reservation. They're grandmas, they're nawas, and we go to them a lot, and they'll tell us this is what you're going to do, this is how we're going to do it. And you know, and that's how I ran my campaign. I went to the grandmas, I went to the nawas and talked to them. And the biggest thing is to listen to understand, and don't come listening thinking that you have all the answers. And definitely we as representatives do not have all the answers. And so we need to hear from you guys, because each community is unique, different, just a little bit. There's a lot of similarities, but we are unique. And so just thanks. I appreciate this discussion.
Organic leaders and organic organizing. We're going to take one more question as we go out, but before we do that, there's a couple of people that we haven't thanked or acknowledged that I really want to thank and acknowledge, and that is Chris Lowry and Jacob LaRue, both from Southeast Wyoming DSA, who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this event happen. And that includes communicating with people, that includes handling all of the tech, because some of us are better at handling the tech than others. And it includes just cheerleading as we have, you know, every day that we've gone through this process, including the day that we found out that we were going to be discussing a now dead bill instead of a living bill. And did we want to keep doing that? And you know, the spirit of everyone in our DSA chapter and the spirit of everyone who was starting to organize around this was, heck yeah, we want to have this forum. In fact, we really need to have the forum now to get us ready for next year. So thank you so much, Chris and Jacob, and thank you to Yana as well and everyone in the chapter for the work that you all have done, as well as Amanda and Barry for speaking on behalf of the chapter. And thanks, Jason, for coming. And we've got one more question, and that is again from Matthew. So go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I'll try to make this quick. Wyoming, in the Wyoming Constitution, there's this provision that the state legislature is supposed to be like a legislature of citizens, supposed to be citizen legislators. And I guess that's usually interpreted to mean that we don't pay our legislators, like we pay them hardly anything and they only meet a short time per year. And the consequence of that is that our state legislature is like largely composed of landowners, business owners, and attorneys. And I'm wondering if our our elected legislators, do you think that class plays a role in getting these bills passed or struck down? Class in the legislature itself? That's my question.
Absolutely. I often feel like one of very few voices in the legislature that actually understands economic instability and insecurity. And I think that's why we don't have Medicaid expansion in this state. I think that's why we don't have a higher minimum wage. I listened to a appropriations committee meeting where they were talking about COVID relief money for renters, and all of the conversation revolved around the poor landlords and not the people that were worried about keeping a roof over their head. It's absent. There's definitely a divide. It's not easy to move your life to Cheyenne. It's when people talk about campaign funding for their campaigns, they're like, oh, ask your friends and family. Well, what if you don't have friends and family with money? Poor people are barred from the conversation and in every step of the way. They're not in the legislature. They don't have lobbyists there for them. I had a bill that I introduced actually to Representative Clifford's committee on car insurance, which I won't get into all the details on, but the insurance companies just came out and just like hammered because someone showed up for the little guy. And there's so much missing from the conversation because there aren't enough little guys there. And we scare them.
That's my favorite part.
100% agree. Class plays a big issue. It's so, I've learned to prepare myself in my second term. It's so hard to listen to those conversations that Carly kind of highlighted for you. But it's in so many different areas, right? Like in everything, class and this privilege and the ignorance and the lack of understanding. It could be so overwhelming. But to have young people like Carly serving with me, who is unapologetic that she struggles and she owns that space. She's such a blessing and reminds me why I'm there, what I'm fighting for, why I'm perseverant, why I'm so resilient. Because I have a colleague right beside me that understands, and that means more to me than a lot of things, and it keeps me fighting.
Thank you so much, all of you. And this has been a blessing for us to have all of you here. Jason Call best of luck with your continuing campaign for House from Washington. And thank you for sharing the lessons that you've learned with us today. Thanks, Representatives Provenza and Clifford, for coming completely exhausted, completely spent, and you decided to give us one more hour of your time, and we're not going to forget that. I promise you. Thank you so much, Amanda Barnes, for your heartfelt words. Thanks, Barry is not here, but thank you, Barry, for giving us a model of how to empower and educate our young people. That's so important for this fight and for all of these fights, because young people don't yet know what they can and can't do, and they are absolutely key to that struggle. We are this has been live streaming and has been recorded. And so we will have this recording available for folks to listen to, for you to share with people. And again, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And please consider joining Southeast Wyoming DSA if you are in the Cheyenne or Laramie area. There are also organizing committees being started in 2 other places in Wyoming as well, including up in Casper. And so we'll have more information about that later. But again, thanks everyone, and thanks Yana for co-hosting. And all you DSA peeps and comrades for helping us get this this conversation off the ground. Thanks everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
And thank you, Matt.
Fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
Mm.